Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 579, The Kings of the Ring, part 6. It always struck me as a bit odd that one of the most modern locations in Tokyo is so intimately associated with the ancient tradition of the yokozuna. You see, Meiji Shrine in the heart of Tokyo is one of the most scenic and beautiful parts of the whole city. It's this gorgeous park with a massive and beautiful shrine nestled into it, a place I've seen, with good reason, described as an oasis of calm in the hectic central parts of Tokyo, evoking this wonderful sense of timelessness and ancientness in the middle of the modern heart of the nation's core. Which is why it's funny when you tell people Meiji Shrine is in fact one of the newest religious institutions in Tokyo. Construction didn't even start until 1915, and it took until 1920 to finish, which means Meiji Shrine itself is just over 100 years old. And that makes it kind of ironic that today one of the most storied rituals associated with one of the most ancient ranks of sumo has become indelibly associated with the city's newest major Shinto shrine. You see, at some point, and I've found differing answers as to when and why, it became a part of yokozuna promotion to do a special dohyo iri, a ceremony for entering the sumo ring, at Meiji Shrine. Twice a year, there are special dohyo iri done by active yokozuna during the New Year's Festival and the Autumn Harvest Festival. In addition, the very first dohyo iri a yokozuna ever does is done at Meiji Shrine. Of course, it doesn't take much to see why Meiji Shrine has this special privilege. It is, after all, the spiritual resting place of the Meiji Emperor, who, at least symbolically speaking, is one of the most important figures in modern Japanese history. Sumo itself has plenty of associations with the imperial family. In some tellings, the first sumo match ever was between the god Takemikazuchi and Takeminakata, when Takemikazuchi was charged with conquering our world on behalf of Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Wrestling was also one of the expected skills of the guards of the imperial family back in the murky and distant past. Again, there are stories about the first sumo wrestlers coming from those guards, though how much stock to put in those tales as the origin of sumo is debatable, let's call it that. Of course, in more recent years, the imperial family still has a sponsored box for every tournament. My understanding is they don't go all the time, but if there are extra metal detectors and security when you show up for a tournament day, it's pretty likely someone from the imperial family is there. And of course, the trophy the winning top division wrestler gets is called the Tennohai, the Emperor's Cup, and was presented to the Japan Sumo Association by then Crown Prince Hirohito back in 1925. What I'm getting at here is that there are a lot of attempts to bind that most consciously Japanese of sports, sumo, to that most consciously Japanese of institutions, the imperial throne, and that's a big part of why a ritual shrouded in such antiquity happens at such a modern institution. Which I guess is representative more broadly, in a certain sense, of how sumo itself is simultaneously this very modern institution in its current form, and this key part of a national mythos about Japan itself that is fundamentally timeless. That mythos, of course, including who the heroic yokozuna are and where they come from. And I can't help but imagine that many such philosophic questions were on the mind of a lot of spectators, even if they wouldn't phrase those questions in the same way, when on the morning of January 28, 1993, they came to watch Japan's newly minted 64th yokozuna perform his Hatsudohyo iri, the very first time doing the dohyo iri ritual on the grounds of Meiji Shrine. For the very first time, that person was not going to be Japanese. The announcement had been made about a week earlier, with a carefully stage-crafted ritual set up by the Japan Sumo Association. Everyone knew this was likely to happen, and so nobody was surprised when representatives wearing black haori overcoats from the Japan Sumo Association showed up at Azumasekibeya and strode in to inform Akebono that he had been promoted. Clearly, he'd been coached on what to expect, too. His very first statement upon hearing the news was, in flawless Keigo honorific Japanese, to announce his acceptance and his intent to practice as hard as he could to protect the dignity of the name Yokozuna. More meaningful to Akebono, I imagine, was what came next. The clearing of the Azumaseki Keikoba, the practice floor, so that Chad Rowan could now learn the complex new rituals associated with wearing, for the first time, his tsuna, the rope which weighed about 40 pounds, and which gave the rank of yokozuna its name and marked him as one of the greatest. Teaching him this was the since-retired Chiyo no Fuji, the same man whose dignity and aura had so impressed him back in the day, which had inspired Akebono to try for the rank he now held. Learning the steps of the new ritual he would be expected to perform as a yokozuna from someone like that, well, you'd have to imagine it would mean something. Of course, the whole thing was carefully stage-managed. The Japan Sumo Association is just kind of like that, not really the kind of organization that leaves things to chance or happenstance. It's all part of protecting the image of the yokozuna rank itself and the importance the rank holds in the hierarchy of sumo. Another part of that dignity, in a certain sense, is of course that we don't really know the deliberations around making Akebono a yokozuna. We don't know how those discussions went down. There's not a public record of Yokozuna Deliberation Council meetings, despite the fact that they are a government-supported entity with several politicians on staff. Likely, of course, the council just felt they had no choice. When Konishiki hadn't gotten his rope, part of the defense offered for that choice by then-council chairman Dewa Naomi was that Konishiki had not won 2 tournaments back-to-back as an Olzeki, which Akebono now had. If he didn't get his rope as a result, well, that would just prove that the lack of a non-Japanese yokozuna had nothing to do with questions of character or ability. It was simply a belief that Americans couldn't hold up to the rank. And in the 1990s, an era of fraught Japanese-American tensions over economics, security issues, George Bush puking on the prime minister, Japanese corporations buying up businesses and land in America, well, the narrative that would have ensued if Akebono, with his good reputation, his stellar performances, had hit the metrics laid out for promotion and then not gotten it, that would have been pretty bad for the notoriously controversy-averse Japan Sumo Association. Remember, when Konishiki had made those public remarks, which he did later deny making, about not being promoted because of racism, that had led to literal questioning of the foreign and prime ministers in the Diet. If that story came back around... Of course, I'm not trying to say here that Akebono was promoted because the Sumo Association felt they had to do it or that he didn't earn the status. He manifestly did. But I do wonder what those Yokozuna Deliberation Council meetings looked like and how many onlookers at that first ceremony in Meiji Shrine were asking themselves similar questions about what exactly this all meant. At first, though, Akebono seems not to have felt those concerns too deeply or been too distracted by those discussions. Maybe that's what made him the ideal first foreign yokozuna. Even much later in his career, at the pinnacle of sumo, Akebono would describe his approach to his new rank as not that different from how he approached being a rank and filer in the top division. Be himself, be respectful, compete hard. As he put it, he was first and foremost a professional athlete, there to give it his all every time he was in the ring. But of course, there's more to being a yokozuna than just competing your hardest, and there's more that comes with the rank than just the braided tsuna rope itself. As Akebono would later put it, describing the time right after his promotion, quote, "I was bad." And this is a note for the non-90s kids in the room, as in badass, not as in lacking skill. I had confidence, because, seriously, being from where I was and what I went through and not having money all the time and this and that, and then suddenly you get a Mercedes, girls, hotels, houses, big guys owning companies, and they're kissing your ass because you kicking ass out there. It was mean. And as a side note, I love reading Akebono quotes. They're so fun. Mean, by the way, is apparently a slang used in parts of the Pacific for awesome. The vast majority of rikishi in sumo, you see, work very hard for not much payoff. Being a rikishi is a grueling job with very little reward. I cannot stress this enough. There are at any given time about 600 rikishi on the full bansuke, and only the 28 in Juryo, the 34 in Makuuchi, and at any given time around 6 to 9 people in Sanyaku plus the yokozuna actually get paid. For those doing the math, that's slightly less than 1 out of every 10 people on the Bansuke who is actually making a salary. But if you're one of the top 10 or so, and especially if you're a yokozuna, you definitely get paid. The monthly salary for a yokozuna is about 2.8 million yen. By the current exchange rate, that's just under 20,000 US dollars, so a yearly income of around $240,000. By sports standards, that's not crazy, of course. That's the equivalent of 2 higher-end AHL minor league players in ice hockey, and it's basically a rounding error for the National Basketball Association, the National Football Association, and Major League Baseball. Ain't no money in sports like American money in sports, baby. And even internationally, it's still pretty low. Some quick Googling suggests the average salary in the Premier League is about 8.2 million pounds a year, or about 10 million freedom bucks. But sumo, in large part because of the efforts of the Japan Sumo Association, just doesn't have the kind of global reach and advertising revenue to get those kind of salaries. But also, like $200,000 a year is nothing to turn your nose up at either. And that's not even factoring in everything else. For starters, matches in the top division specifically are sponsored. That's why if you watch a tournament, you see that procession of guys with banners walking around the dohyo before every match. Each of those banners costs about 63,000 yen, which is just under $440 today, with a total cap of 61 sponsors per bout. The money for those ads, minus of course some fees kept by the JSA, forms a cash prize handed to the winner of each top division match in envelopes by the Gyoji. Each envelope contains 30,000 yen, so about 250 bucks. On its own, that's not a lot, but it means that for matches with a lot of sponsors, which any match with a yokozuna is going to have, you do get to see the winner field an absolutely ludicrous stack of envelopes. And that's only half the total sponsorship money, by the way. The other half, again minus the fees, goes into the wrestler's retirement account, which is also managed by the JSA. There's also cash bonuses for each of these Sansho prizes, 2 million yen each, so about $14,000, though Ozeki and Yokozuna are not eligible for those, plus a cool 10 million yen for winning a tournament, about $70,000. Then, of course, there are all the gifts you get, both monetary and not, especially again as a yokozuna, the sponsorship deals, even things like the sale of your tegata, the signed handprints that are one of the most common sumo souvenirs. Again, none of it's going to be crazy money by the standards of basically any other major sport, but you're going to do pretty well for yourself, especially if, say, you grew up in a poorer part of Hawaii, in a family with some financial struggles. I have to imagine it feels pretty good. And by his own recollections to his autobiographer Mark Panic, Akebono, who was, let's remember, just about to turn 24 when he became a yokozuna, but was very much a married family man when he sat down to be interviewed by Panic, found one of the benefits of his new rank more enticing than any other: the women. Of course, as a family man at that point, Akebono pointedly did not go into more detail than that, but it would basically be a whole other episode to talk about the culture around sex and dating in Japan, something that I feel I should note for the benefit of those listeners I happen to be married to, I have no personal experience with. Still, I know enough to know that there's a lot less prurience around sexuality in some respects, even as there are also some very intense gendered expectations around dating and sex, and especially in sumo, the model of traditional masculinity rikishi are supposed to live with both includes a very healthy sexual appetite and not a lot of regard for the women in their lives affected by that. But again, that's a whole other episode, but it is worth noting that especially early on, Akebono seems to have really enjoyed being the model of a sort of rock star yokozuna. His fellow foreign-born rikishi and eventually tsukebito, helper, Daiki, whose birth name is Percy Kipapa, he's also Hawaiian, later described Akebono as, quote, the pimp daddy of sumo wrestlers, unquote, rolling up to practice in a nice Benz limo with a Bose sound system and always wearing new, colorful kimono. Quote, he knows the true meaning of Akebono like the rising sun. When he comes into a room, everybody's, woo, they see the brightness. Of course, there was a cost to all of this glitz and glamour. In the world of sumo, you hear much waxing poetic about the so-called burden of the tsuna, the weight of expectations that comes with being a yokozuna. Part of that, of course, involves winning. And to be clear, Akebono did a lot of winning from this point onward. Just from his time as a yokozuna until he retired, he participated in 48 tournaments and would end up with an overall record of 432 wins to 122 losses, plus 166 matches missed due to injury. That's damn good. He picked up 8 more Yusho, or championships, and 12 more Junyusho, runner-up finishes, over that span too. That means he either won or was runner-up in over 40% of the tournaments he participated in. And that's very good, particularly when you note this was an era where the upper end of the Bansuke was very competitive, with strong ozeki like Konishiki and eventually Kaio, who debuted around the same time Akebono did, as well as Wakanohana and Takanohana and a 4th yokozuna, Musashi Maru, who would join them a few years later. I am not enough of a sumo historian to say this was the most competitive era for the top division, but it was certainly high on the list. But the burden of the tsuna isn't just the demand that you win, it's what you do outside of the ring too. Even if sumo is not as popular as it used to be, a yokozuna is still definitionally a national celebrity. You will get mobbed by crowds, as tends to happen to all celebrities. Some of the people in those crowds will have, let's call them, boundary issues. People will get up in your space in uncomfortable ways. And then there's the schedule. Mark Panek describes shadowing Akebono and seeing him torn in a million different directions during his downtime, being sent around to shrines to do his dohyo iri for them, making appearances at the openings of fancy restaurants or at parties for the famous and elite. Some of these events were things Akebono had set up and was paid for directly, but the vast majority were events set up by Azumaseki Stable's Okami-san, Takamiyama's wife, Kazue, who was, as is the case in all stables, responsible for managing the daily operations and collecting the appearance fees the yokozuna brought in, among other things. Indeed, while Akebono was certainly not poor, it's worth noting that not all or even most of the money he made went into his own pocket. Sumo's traditionalistic hierarchies meant that in a sense, Takamiyama, as the oyakata of Azumaseki Beya, was Akebono's head of household. Well after 1947, the head of household no longer had legal control over the members of his family, the ethos of sumo had been slower to update than the legal mandates of the post-war constitution. As Takamiyama himself had put it when Mark Panek asked him about this, quote, "You've got to remember that you belong to the Beya. Whether it's Takasago Beya or Azumaseki Beya, the Kyokai, the Japan Sumo Association, comes first, then the Beya, not you." It's a lot to deal with, particularly because, as all this was happening, Akebono's father, Randy Rowan, was also in the middle of a desperate battle against increasingly bad complications from diabetes, a battle he would eventually lose in the summer of 1993, living just long enough to see his son take his first tournament win as a yokozuna in the July of '93 tournament. That's really a lot to manage, especially for someone that young. And then in 1994, one more complication came the young yokozuna's way. Well, really two, but one was more abstract than the other. First, in 1994, Akebono faced his first serious injury as a yokozuna, ending what had been at that point a pretty dominant run. Over the course of 7 tournaments since getting promoted, Akebono had won 4 and come in second in 1, and had never managed less than the 10-5 showing. And then came day 11 of the May 1994 tournament, with Akebono taking on the Maegashira 1, Takatoriki. Incidentally, that's also Taiho's son-in-law and heir, though he did end up getting booted from the Sumo Association for his involvement in illegal gambling. Anyway, at the start of the match, Akebono came in with a fierce charge, and Takatoriki, well, the charitable interpretation is he did what's called a hit and shift, a less powerful charge that then immediately moves sideways to deflect someone's momentum so you can knock them off balance. The less charitable interpretation is that Takatoriki pulled what's called a henka, jumping to the side instead of charging forward. That is not illegal in sumo, but it is considered, for lack of a more definite term, kind of a jerkish thing to do. You're essentially tricking someone into charging at a target that's not there, so you can easily knock them off balance before their momentum can recover. I've seen what Takatoriki did described both ways. I can't find video of the match, so I can't call which one is accurate. Regardless, Akebono went out of the dohyo, and as he did, he hit his knee hard on the clay surface. And he was already having knee problems at this point. Sumo still in 2025 does not have the kind of medical support staff you see in, say, the NFL. And at any rate, a yokozuna, especially one trained by someone like Takamiyama, is not going to sit out a tournament because their knee hurts. And so, Akebono now had a serious knee injury, because when he hit his knee like that, he couldn't stand afterwards. He had to be helped out into a wheelchair. Now, he was a yokozuna, and so he couldn't be demoted at this point. Missing tournaments due to injury was not a concern in that respect. What was a concern was rehabbing to get back into the dohyo, and Akebono really ruffled a lot of feathers because he did not go with the traditional approach. The traditional approach is just to let your oyakata decide when and how you're ready to get back to practice. But none of those oyakata, of course, are doctors. All of them are former sumo wrestlers. They have no medical training or knowledge. Akebono pointedly did not just follow the directives of Takamiyama on when to come back and train. He ignored them and flew back to the US to work with a sports medicine and rehab doctor who did surgery on his knee to repair the soft tissue. And when he came back to Japan, he didn't start doing traditional training right away. He went through physical therapy with a modern personal trainer. I cannot stress enough how unusual that was for sumo in the 90s. It's become a lot more common now, and for a very good reason. It is a much smarter approach. But 30 years ago, the model for recovery was way more traditional and, frankly, as a result, a lot worse and much more dangerous for the rikishi involved. Of course, since Akebono was the first gaijin yokozuna, his decision to eschew the usual way of doing things turned some heads. And to make matters worse, the expected result of his absence from the dohyo, a clearing of the field for the still then Ozeki Takanohana and Wakanohana to make their runs for yokozuna status and prove that Japanese wrestlers could still hang with the foreigners, didn't quite work out that way. The July 1994 tournament was supposed to be the start of this magnificent run for the Hanada brothers, which would reclaim the national honor of the Japanese sumo world, and in that tournament, both Hanadas and everybody else instead ran into yet another Hawaiian brick wall. This particular brick wall was named Musashimaru Koyo, 2 years Akebono's junior and a member of Musashigawa Beya, another stable that had seen the writing on the wall and started recruiting talent overseas. The July 94 tournament saw Musashimaru, who by this point worked his way up to Ozeki himself, put both Hanadas onto the clay on his way to a Zensho Yusho, a tournament victory where he won all 15 matches. It was, simply put, an old-fashioned butt-whooping. It was also the start of one of the big changes of sumo that happens during this time because of Akebono and others like him that radically remade the playing field. In the course of his book, Mark Panic interviewed a guest at the 1998 retirement ceremony for George Kalima, Shikuna Yamato. That guest was a college wrestler whose first name was Heath, who'd been looking to join Yamato's stable, Magaki Beya, back in 1994. And Heath told Panic, quote, "When Musashimaru won the tournament, I knew it wasn't good." Heath had already been accepted to Magaki Beya and had returned to the US to get his visa paperwork in order, quote, "I was supposed to fly up 2 days later, but they called me the next day and told me not to bother, that they wouldn't take me." You see, a new dictate had come down from the Japan Sumo Association, an informal cap on the number of foreigners stables were allowed to recruit, referred to rather straightforwardly as the one gaijin per beya rule. Now, you won't find this rule listed on the Japan Sumo Association rules or anywhere like that. It's not formally written out anywhere to my knowledge, nor was the decision-making process behind the rule made public at any point. The JSA is a private organization, again, even if it does get a lot of assistance from the government, so it doesn't have to do things like that. We can't know what exactly pushed the JSA's then chairman, Dewa no Umi, to decide on a cap on foreign recruitment in sumo, but we do have leaks from meeting notes that some form of ban on foreigners in sumo had been discussed by JSA leadership as far back as Takamiyama's 1972 tournament victory. This idea had been floating around for a while. Dewa no Umi had initially refused pressure to instate that ban, but had hinted as early as 1992 that he was starting to think about it when he gave a public address referring to his concerns around cliquish foreigners who only spent time together outside of the dohyo and who were as a result not fully being immersed in the culture of sumo. This is one of the more common arguments for the rule I've seen. If you have too many non-Japanese people, sumo will lose the intangible cultural properties that are so important to the nature of the sport itself. To be honest, I really think that's kinda crap. If you look at the stories told by the Hawaiians and other foreigners about their time wrestling in Japan, it's pretty clear they had internalized the expectations around their public persona and the hierarchy between junior and senior stablemates. This is all just, in my view, another variant of that foreigners can never really understand Japan shtick. More broadly, by 1992, Akebono was dominating the Bansuke with Konishiki right behind him, and the sense that foreign wrestlers were taking over sumo proved to be compelling, especially when the hoped-for resurgence by the Hanada brothers during Akebono's absence ended with them being freight-trained by Musashi Maru, who, lest we forget, was also an Ozeki at this point, so if he got another Yusho the next tournament, the JSA would have to promote him, and then there'd be 2 non-Japanese yokozuna. Musashi Maru didn't manage that, at least not at first. Takano Hana would come back the next tournament with his own Zensho Yusho perfect score against a 13-2 Musashi Maru, and then would win again in November to make yokozuna at long last. Musashi Maru would stay in Ozeki until 1999, when he did finally put together the 2 back-to-back Yusho to become sumo's 67th yokozuna. But of course, back in the summer of 1994, nobody knew that was how things were going to shake out, and so in July, word went around to the stable masters that from this point forward, they could only have 1 non-Japanese national on their rosters. That rule is still in place, though there are ways around it. If 2 stables merge, foreign wrestlers from both stables are allowed to remain, and a great many wrestlers end up adopting Japanese citizenship, especially at the higher ranks, because if you want to become an oyakata yourself or work for the JSA, you have to be a Japanese citizen, and that frees the slot, so to speak, back up. The ban remains in place, again, down to this day, and nobody at the JSA, at least to my knowledge, has ever explicitly said it exists because of Akebono and Musashi Maru, but it's hard not to look at the dates and suspect that's a big part of the reason. Akebono would finally come back to competition by the November 1994 tournament and would manage a solid 10-5 record as Takano Hana went to his second win and his own yokozuna status. But even with the surgery and the rehab, the pressure he'd been putting on his body meant his knee never fully healed. From this point forward, he'd pretty reliably miss tournaments at least once a year going forward, with a bigger string of absences in 1995, 1996, 1998, and 1999. And he would never put up the ludicrous Yusho numbers like Taiho did, even though initially he looked to be going at that pace, though again, to be fair, he had both more injury problems than Taiho, and much fiercer competition, I think it's fair to say, in terms of the overall quality of the Bansuke. If you're wondering, Akebono's last tournament was the final tournament of the year 2000. During that tournament, he got his 11th Yusho after going 14-1, his 8th tournament victory as a yokozuna. He would announce his retirement in 2001, citing the knee injury as the main culprit. We'll talk more about Akebono's career next week in our final episode of this miniseries, but I just want to note here that he was a great yokozuna, but not quite a generational talent like Taiho. Takano Hana, despite taking longer to make yokozuna, really was the generational figure of 90s sumo. He retired in 2003, but hadn't really been competing since 2001. But unlike Akebono, he never had as many consistent injury problems and got 15 Yusho as a yokozuna, 22 tournament victories in the top division overall. Wakano Hana, if you're wondering, officially retired in May of 2001, but hadn't really been competing since September of the previous year, and officially ended his career with only 5 top division victories and 0 as a yokozuna. What I'm getting at here is not, to be clear, the idea that Akebono was not good or anything like that. I just think his injury luck was kind of a problem, but that's a thing in any contact sport. You just never know how it's going to go. The injury bouts were, by Akebono's own admission, big confidence shakers, both for the obvious reasons injuries usually are, and because of the burden of the tsuna. You see, even an ozeki can, if necessary, just muddle through, manage to pick up enough wins to get a winning record just barely, or even mix in a couple of makekoshi losing records and maintain their rank, just as long as they don't post back-to-back losing records. But that is not acceptable for a yokozuna. The expectation is that you are either dominating and in competition for the yusho, or you withdraw from the tournament, fake an injury if you have to. Usually you don't have to fake it, they usually have at least one, to protect the dignity of the rank of yokozuna. You can't just be good enough, you have to be great. This means if you're injured, you have a lot of downtime, which is a lot of time for a high-performing athlete under a lot of pressure to get in his own head. And this definitely contributed to one of the more infamous moments of Akebono's career, the story I want to end today with, his public blow-up with the man then known as Kokonoe Oyakata, but we know him as Chiyono Fuji. Now, Chiyono Fuji had by this point retired and taken over his own stable, Kokonoe stable, that's why he's Kokonoe Oyakata. Meanwhile, in March of 1996, Akebono was in the middle of another big bout of injury, attempting to return to form, but that wasn't going very well. He'd had to withdraw from the January tournament after a series of losses. He couldn't stay in, that would tarnish the name Yokozuna, and it was now looking like he couldn't compete in March either. In point of fact, he'd already decided not to compete in March, but he was still expected to go to Osaka, which is the venue for the March tournament, and perform his social obligations as a yokozuna, to show up and act like nothing was wrong. As he understood it, these obligations included visits with his koenkai, the supporters who financially supported him and Azuma Sekibeya, and who had set up a night at a local hostess club which Akebono was expected to attend, alongside several other wrestlers who'd been invited. He showed up. His understanding of his obligations as a yokozuna was that even if he felt terrible for being unable to compete, he had to put on a good face and show up for his supporters. Chiyono Fuji showed up too, and the drinks flowed freely, but then Chiyono Fuji got up after a few hours to leave, stopped by a pretty drunk Akebono's table, and said something to him, and Akebono blew up. Nobody's entirely sure what Chiyono Fuji said, some of that famous sumo tight-lippedness on display. Presumably only the two men involved knew for sure, and not to spoil anything, but they have both since passed on, so we'll never really know. But whatever it was, it upset Akebono quite a bit. Apparently, as Chiyono Fuji went to walk away, Akebono overturned the table and stood up as if to challenge him to a fight. He didn't actually hit Chiyono Fuji, that would have been unforgivable in the eyes of the JSA, but according to witnesses there, Koenkai supporters, and other wrestlers who were present, the active yokozuna looked for all the world like he was about to punch the retired one. What probably happened here, again, neither man really ever talked about this in detail, so we don't know for sure, is that Chiyono Fuji said something like, "You shouldn't be partying here when you can't perform on the dohyo." That certainly fits the available evidence and explains why Akebono was upset, particularly because, according to Persiki Papa / Daiki, Chiyono Fuji was muttering the phrase "gaijin yaro" under his breath as he left, something like "goddamn foreigner." As an aside, I'm not saying Chiyono Fuji was like a racist or bigoted against foreign rikishi or something like that. If nothing else, later in his career when he was on the Yokozuna Deliberation Council, he was effusive in his praise of Asashoryu, another non-Japanese Yokozuna, and was always brutally hard on Wakano Hana, who is one of two Yokozuna in history to finish a tournament while still having a losing record. Chiyono Fuji, for lack of a better phrase, I think was just a real stickler for the standards of the Yokozuna as he saw them, and saw Akebono as not living up to them. Likely that's what set Akebono off. He was, by his own admission, a perfectionist, and failing to perform on the dohyo and now being told by his idol that his understanding of his social obligations as a Yokozuna weren't just wrong, but like stupidly wrong. If you're under a lot of pressure, I can see how that would make you snap. But even so, Akebono smashed a table, he knocked over a hostess, angrily confronted a Noyakata, and stormed out drunkenly, during which time he broke a sign, too. At least one Samoan wrestler, Non-Kairyu, had literally been expelled from sumo after drunkenly assaulting a hotel owner, and now here was Akebono, seeming to prove he was no better despite the mantle of yokozuna. You can also see, I think, why even with his biographer, with whom he was normally very frank, Akebono didn't really want to talk about this at all. Ultimately, though, the Japan Sumo Association didn't do much more than issue a verbal reprimand after Akebono issued a tearful apology the next day. Years later, when Mark Panic asked Akebono about this exact moment, and apparently all he had to say was Osaka and the Yokozuna knew exactly what was going to come, this is what Akebono had to say. Quote, "Bro, you know me. I'm different because I know the truth. Long as I know the truth, I don't give a shit what the press says about me. I mean, that might be bad for my image and my stuff like that, but like I said, the people who know, they know. The people who don't know, they're never going to understand us guys. If I was Chad back in Hawaii, I'd be walking around in summer, no shirt, short pants, cruising at the beach. There's some stuff you have to separate. It's hard, very hard, especially to get to where I am. You're always in the public eye, and sometimes you just get frustrated because you don't understand why. Why? That's just the way it is." It was 1998 when he gave that interview, and I think some distance had helped stem the hurt. As we'll see, Akebono would find his acceptance as a yokozuna eventually. But we're not quite there yet, and we'll get there, and to the legacy of the first foreign yokozuna next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com, and you can support us on Patreon. Special thanks to new patron Jimmy for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the 7th and final part of this series.